Hey, Psych students, it's Dr. G. We are getting really close to the end of the semester, and this week you have been learning about work groups and work teams. So this week we're going to take a short little detour. This lecture should be pretty short for the week. I know you have a lot of other things to work on, and I'd like to really start our discussion on leadership on the last week of classes. But today we're going to talk a little bit about modern work teams and trends. So we are going to talk about work teams of the 21st century. And in particular, we're going to talk about some research that has been done on modern trends in work teams since the year 2000, group learning, mental models, different types of work teams, and how effective work teams can be and how to make them more effective. And then we'll talk a little bit about current trends in both virtual teams and selection. So we're going to start by talking about work teams of the 21st century. Okay, I could stop doing it that way, but I don't really want to. It's fun. So let's talk a little bit about group collaboration and learning. So in general, group learning is a really critical part of working as a functioning work team. And so this is something that researchers in IO psychology actually consider an outcome. So group learning is not just a process, it is treated as an outcome. You have a new shared understanding between group members, and you have to be able to have that understanding if you want to be able to work effectively with your fellow group members. And so this group learning requires a few different things that have some cognitive basis. It includes sharing this new understanding that you're having, like communication is obviously key here. Sharing that new understanding, being able to store that and hold on to that for a later point in time, and then later retrieving that understanding. This isn't something that you've learned and then you have to suddenly forget. If you want to be able to keep engaging in this group learning, you have to hold on to that shared understanding and be able to draw it back when you need it. And when we talk about this, we talk about this a little bit more in cognitive psychology, but this is related to a mental model. And when we talk about a mental model, and this is basically an organized knowledge structure that basically helps an individual make sense of their world. It not only allows us to do that, it also allows us to be able to describe and explain and predict behaviors. And we need to be able to do this with other people on our team. We have to have a pretty good understanding of how we will expect other members in our group to behave when we give them that information. And so when we are describing, explaining, and predicting the behavior of others to help coordinate our efforts, this is a case where we are engaging in a shared mental model. So it's not just an individual's mental model. When you start making it about other people and you're coordinating your efforts, at that point it becomes shared. So let's talk a little bit more about these shared mental models. Generally, a shared mental model is probably going to be a lot more useful in situations where there's a lot of pressure. There's deadlines. There might be stress. There has to be a really quick turnaround time. And there may not necessarily be a lot of time to discuss the issues and the situations. Everybody needs to be on the same page. And it's a lot easier to do that if you already have a pretty good understanding of where other people in your group or your team are coming from. If you don't really have that, if you don't really have the experience and the knowledge of other people in your group, you can't have that shared mental model, and that ultimately is going to hurt the effectiveness and the efficacy of the decisions that you make. And we find that using a shared mental model, understanding how the other people in your group are going to operate, this helps aid formation of strategy, it aids coordination, it aids cooperation, and it aids communication. And by and large, all of these things, if you have those things, are going to aid team performance overall. And generally, shared mental models are going to be a lot more likely with good communication and with strong connections between group members. If there's a weak link, or if people are not open to sharing their thoughts or their ideas or their opinions, it's going to be harder to come to that shared mental model. It's going to be hard to make predictions about how other people are going to behave. And because of that, it's going to be a lot harder to engage in group learning or effective group decisions. So when we talk about work teams, and there is a little bit of debate about whether or not we should actually be characterizing different types of work teams, but researchers have identified about 5 different categories of work teams. These are typically going to be based on what is produced by the team or the team's primary purpose. And so these will include the 5 different team types you see here. And we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So that includes production teams, that includes management teams, that includes service teams, project teams, and advisory teams. So what are each of these? Well, let's start with the production team. A production team, if obviously you can kind of get from the name, a production team is associated with making a type of product. These are usually going to be what you would consider your frontline employees that basically produce a tangible output of some kind. They are typically going to be self-managed, self-led, and self-directed. They're responsible for production at the front end. So some really common examples of production teams do include electronics assembly units, coal mining crews, candy production crews. Obviously, they are going to have to listen to administrators or higher ups and bosses and things like that. But generally, this group that is working together to produce that output will have certain goals. They will be managing themselves, and they will be relatively self-directed. A management team are basically teams of corporate executives or steering committees or managers. Basically, their job is to coordinate other work units that are under their direction. And their responsibilities may include things like planning. Anytime that I've ever been on something that was called a steering committee, I was usually involved in planning something like a conference. Possibly budgeting, possibly staffing, and some really common examples of management teams do include things like management teams, military command teams, or different types of healthcare teams. Service teams. So these are probably one of the more common ones you might be familiar with. These teams are designed to attend to the needs of customers. They will often be serving multiple customers at a time. And some really common examples of service teams include flight attendants, hospital emergency units, retail sales groups like Target groups, Walmart employees, things like that. Project teams. So whereas production teams, management teams, and service teams tend to have a little bit more of a sense of permanency, they're always going to kind of be there, project teams are basically only existing for the purpose of a temporary project. For example, when Coty was planning its inauguration for Dr. Weitzel a few years ago, there was an inauguration planning committee that was basically planning all of the events of this inauguration. Generally, the goal is to work on a temporary project. They are cross-functional, which means you're usually getting people from different departments or different types of groups. So, you have a diverse group of people from within the organization. They're largely going to disband at the completion of a project. Some pretty common examples of project teams will include new product teams, teams that are working on the development and the marketing of a new product, research units, research and development groups, and so on. And then finally, we have advisory teams. These teams are going to basically try to solve problems and recommend solutions. Like project teams, these are typically going to be on a temporary basis. Some really common examples of advisory teams include groups like quality circles, employee involvement teams, university advisory groups to a college or university president to look into things like employee morale, things like that. But there's a lot of debate about whether or not we should characterize and categorize these different work teams into these different structures. So there are some researchers, such as a paper from 2012 from Hollenbeck and colleagues, that actually suggested that maybe it's not the best idea to categorize these different types of work teams on the basis of what they produce or what their primary process is. Rather, Hollenbeck and colleagues suggested that you basically categorize work teams on the basis of 3 different characteristics. First of all, skill differentiation. So the degree to which members have these different types of skills, authority differentiation. So basically how much decision making is entrusted to certain members or subgroups of that group. And then temporal stability, the team members' history of working with each other and expectations of collaborating in the future. So not everybody agrees that we should necessarily be characterizing work teams on the basis of their processes or what they produce. Now, this five category classification system that I just presented you with is just one way to think about it. But another way that we can kind of think about work teams is to the extent that they are self-regulating. So this is another dimension on which we can consider a work team. Typically, when we talk about self-regulation, we are talking about other terminology that tends to be used interchangeably with self-regulation. Are they self-managing? Are they self-directing? Are they self-leading? So ultimately, when we're asking, is a work team self-regulating, does the work team assume complete responsibility for a product or a process? So in the case of something like a production team that is producing a very, very tangible output, by and large, that work team absolutely is assuming complete responsibility for a product. Now, compare that to something like a service team, where your job might be working as a cashier at like a Target or a Walmart or something. You did not create that product that you are selling. You did not necessarily do anything with the quality of the product. You were just making that product available to consumers and basically engaging in a financial transaction. And so in that case, that would be less self-regulated. So when we talk about a team that is self-regulating, something that is starting to gain more parlance in IO psychology is the concept of a self-managed work team, or SMWT. And this is becoming increasingly common in organizations. A paper back in 2001 actually reported that by 1999, about 72% of Fortune 1000 companies had at least one SMWT working within them. So let's talk a little bit about how work teams can be effective and what sort of things can affect the effectiveness of work teams. So there was originally a framework produced by Cohen back in 1994 that said that there are basically 3 dimensions of effectiveness. So first of all, there is team performance. This is basically some different metrics that look at how well the team is performing, including things like productivity, quality, how much cost control you're trying to engage in, the attitudes of team members, and then withdrawal behaviors, things like tardiness, absenteeism, turnover, etc. So we can think about some of these aspects and how they might relate to work team effectiveness. We can also consider 2 very different types of behaviors. One that is referred to as task work, which are the task-oriented aspects of work, and then we can think about teamwork, which is fundamentally different from just performing a task. Teamwork are the process-oriented aspects of working with a group or working with a team. That includes things like communication, norms, conflict resolution, and things like that. Now, what are some different predictors of team effectiveness? Well, there are a couple of different things. So research has found that organizational context plays a role. Things like rewards, whether or not rewards or incentives are provided. Are we using goals? We know that goals can be helpful in reaching good outcomes. Use of feedback, appropriate training. Aspects related to the composition of the group, as well as the size of the group. So, of course, we've kind of talked about the fact that in general, job performance is very highly predicted by overall cognitive ability, and that also holds true here. Personality traits really seem to play a role. In particular, conscientiousness really seems to be critical. So generally, one of the things that's kind of interesting, so this is a study by Humphrey and colleagues from 2011, and they actually tended to find that the groups that were most effective were variable in terms of extroversion. That means that within this group, there was a wide range of variability with respect to extroversion and introversion, and low variability on conscientiousness. And in general, the best teams are ones where the different introversion, extroversion needs are variable, but conscientiousness is really high. There's a lot of data out there that shows that generally people who are conscientious are more likely to engage in backup behavior and help their other colleagues out. And interestingly enough, people who are very highly extroverted are a lot more likely to receive backup behavior when they ask for it, even if there are other people in the group that need it more. Additionally, some demographic characteristics of group members will play a role as well. In general, high conscientiousness really seems to be critical. Group work design, does the task require you to rely on each other? So does it have a degree of interdependence? Is there goal interdependence? Is the group cohesive? Is the group effective? And do they communicate readily? That's cases where intra-group processes can be helpful. Additionally, are there external group processes? How's the communication outside of the group? Are there external interaction patterns? All of these things can really play a role. One other thing that I will mention, Horowitz and Horowitz back in 2007 actually did find that demographic diversity is surprisingly unrelated to team effectiveness. But generally, diversity that is related to the task itself, things like expertise, education, is actually positively related to team effectiveness. So when we talk about group diversity, we are not necessarily just talking about demographic diversity. We are talking about intellectual diversity, educational diversity, and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and next time we will talk about current trends.